Amy Adams' comments about the desirability of forging a consensus on these issues, but I would just add a note of caution, because I think in order to reach a consensus you actually have to have compromise on all sides, because it's all very well for the government to say and take by all parties around these issues, because otherwise one party can effectively withhold consensus, and we all know realistically that the prior status quo under electoral law did have some failings. Those failings could in some instances be to the advantage of the National Party, and if they define consensus as requiring their agreement on everything, then they can effectively prefer the status quo, even if the status quo is inadequate. So I would just caution a little bit against the pretense that consensus is the ultimate answer. Actually, reasonable compromise leading to consensus is what this Parliament should be aiming for. Can I mention what I think are the three most important principles in electoral law? They are the principle of equity, the principle of freedom of expression, and the principle of the principle of transparency. I think those are the three most important principles. There are other principles like accountability, legitimacy, integrity, viability, clarity and cost effectiveness that have been referred to by the Royal Commission in earlier years, but the three most crucial principles are equity, freedom of expression and transparency. And equity, of course, is crucial, as the report of the Royal Commission on the electoral system said back then. They said that there's a particular importance of achieving fairness between political parties, because at elections voters are primarily choosing between alternative party governments. So there has to be fairness as between parties, but that's not just fairness as between sitting parties represented in this Parliament. Election rules also should not advantage not just one party over another, but nor should they place inequitable barriers on the formation and entry of new parties into Parliament. So that's one of the important principles. The next is freedom of expression, and freedom of expression requires that any person that there shouldn't be undue restrictions on the ability of citizens to freely express their views. Freedom of expression is very, very important. Now, we made proposals around freedom of expression that left the media completely unconstrained, and the media should be completely unconstrained. But there have always been some constraints on political parties. There have always been some constraints on political parties, and there should be. Because if you're going to have a low-cost electoral system like we have in New Zealand, that implies that there have to be some constraints on spending. And those are necessarily a restraint on freedom of expression. But if you don't do that, you actually have election systems like you have in the United States, where people can buy elections, essentially, by outspending the other. And so you get into a ratcheting up of expenditure on both sides of the political debate, and increasingly the only people who can meaningfully participate in election processes in countries with unconstrained expenditure are those with very deep pockets. And that is not democracy. A low-cost election system is appropriate, and freedom of expression doesn't mean an unlimited right to spend in order to buy an election. That's why there are spending constraints on political parties. We've long had them in New Zealand, and we should long continue to have those spending constraints. Now, the third principle is that of transparency. Now, transparency only works if you have transparency around donations, and that's one of the areas where the Labour Party thought that we should go further than this bill does, because we thought that there should be further transparency even than that which is proposed in the bill. This is an area where we may be forced to compromise, but we think it should have gone further. We accept we may have to compromise on that. We can't see why there shouldn't be further transparency in respect of donations. At the last election, I think the Labour Party disclosed about, from memory, 15% of our donations. The source is the 15%. The National Party disclosed the source of less than 10% of their donations. We both spent over $2 million, and yet we only disclosed 10% of our donations. That's not good enough. That's not, well, this law doesn't improve it. You say we wrote the law. Well, that law didn't go far enough in respect of transparency. There is nothing wrong with donating to political parties. It's a good thing to do. But public confidence in the democratic process requires that there be transparency as to donations. Otherwise, you can never escape the imputation that it is substantial donations that have caused a policy position, and that's undermining of public confidence in democracy. And what we're trying to do here is to protect public confidence in democracy, because democracy is so important. The countries of the world that have the biggest problems don't have democracy, or they don't have transparent enough democracy. So transparency is a really, really important principle, and we ought to be having more transparency in respect of donations. This leads me on to the issue of parallel campaigns. Now, parallel campaigns are difficult, because if you don't in some way have some regulation of parallel campaigns, you might as well have no regulation of political parties, because you have theoretical limits of spending and transparency of donations for political parties, but if you don't have some similar rules for people who are advocating for political causes outside of political parties, then you might as well not have any rules for political parties, because it makes a nonsense of them. It makes a nonsense of them. So what we proposed in our submission through the process that the government ran was some transparency around third parties. We did make it clear that the media should be absolutely unconstrained. Nothing in our submission affected the media. But we did say that in respect of third parties, they should not just have to register as being a third party, which is what this bill proposes, but they should have transparency around their donations. Because if they're out advocating for the Labour Party, or for the National Party, or for the Greens, or for ACT, whoever they're advocating for, in effect, through their third-party campaign, it should be clear as to who their funders are, so that we have transparency as to our election process. So we didn't have any limit on what third parties could spend. That's, again, a considerable compromise on the part of the Labour Party compared with our preferred position, where there should at least be some, which should be some limit. It wasn't a tiny limit, but maybe it was too low. We moved away from any threshold, but there should be disclosure, there should be transparency as to the source of the funding of their campaigns if they're spending more than $100,000. That's what we said. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable proposition on the part of the Labour Party, and for the national government to say that they're doing this by consensus illustrates the fact that they can withhold a consensus and actually stick with the status quo where they think that's in their best interests. And in respect of this issue here, I would hope that the National Party is willing to look at this at Select Committee. I really would hope so, because I don't think that we are doing a favour to New Zealand, a favour to democracy. We're not maintaining public confidence in our election process if we don't deal with this important issue, which is the transparency of the campaigns run by third parties. The Royal Commission on Electoral Reform concluded that limited spending by political parties but not parallel campaigners was illogical. So the Royal Commission found that. It's not the Labour Party being selfish in saying this. We're actually taking a principled position that was found by the Royal Commission on this. And we really do hope that this is properly addressed through the Select Committee, and that the government is willing to compromise on it, as we have compromised and as we are compromising in so many other areas. And if they don't, then the talk that we have here about consensual electoral law is actually shown to be hollow words, because consensual. Well, we've got John Hay saying nothing consensual about the way we did it in Labour, and there's some fairness in that criticism. There is some fairness in that criticism, and we have accepted that. But the same accusation will be able to be made against the National Party if they don't follow a consensual route in respect of some of the issues which we are fairly raising and which were raised by the Royal Commission. The National Party can't have it both ways. They can't say on the one hand that we didn't follow a consensual process.
Sorry to interrupt the member. His time has expired.
Thank you.